the name of the one God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. Have any of you ever sat down and tried to figure out how the path of your life has gone? What has led you to do what you've done? What has led you down to become the person you've become? It's a fascinating project. Sometimes a little terrifying, sometimes a little exciting. Our text this morning intrigued me to ask just such a question. How did I get here? What decisions did I make in my life that have made me who I've become? Why did I make that decision and not another? Why did I take that detour and end up in blind alleys that I took? I'm often asked by people, especially by people who are not church people, so how is it that you came to become a priest? I don't often know where those questions are coming from, but my answers are usually pretty varied. But they always include something about an encounter with all kinds of people in my life, with a fair number of people who, by virtue of that encounter, have made me who I am. People who have changed me enormously. A real example of that came to mind as I was thinking about this immediately is someone who has come to my mind often in my life. She was my high school youth group counselor, Aunt Flo. Aunt Flo and Uncle Les were our youth group people. And one night while we were having a party down in her basement, I was upstairs at the sink with her, and we were making some stuff for the party. And just in an offhanded kind of way, she kind of looked at me at one point, and she said, "You know, Bruce, you'd make a good minister one day." Well, I looked at her as if she were nuts. And I laughed, and I said, "Aunt Flo, you must be crazy." Nothing could have been more ridiculous to this young mind of mine than that. Here I am. Point is that our lessons this morning are all about this God who seems to keep getting into our face. Keeps getting into our business. I don't know if you found that to be true, but I certainly have. Our psalm this morning is one of my favorite psalms, 139. It's just one of those powerful reflections on who this God is with us. This God who, in fact, knows us before we are knit together in our mother's womb, knows us inside and out, upside and down, knows all about me and loves me even so. Now, depending on how I'm feeling about myself that particular day, that idea that God knows me might be very frightening, or maybe even sometimes comforting. Then there's the story of young Samuel, called by God to become the prophet of the people Israel. I'm reminded that one of our contemporary Protestant denominations has adopted the tagline, "God is still speaking." And of course, the cynical quip is always, "But is anyone listening?" In our story, we're reminded that God is perhaps all about all of those places in our lives where we hear the whispering voice that comes to us in the dead of the night. that comes to us out of the offhanded comment that somebody's making to us, that comes to us out of an encounter with something we don't understand or something we need to grapple with, some bad thing that's happened that all of a sudden needs to be made sense of. It's hard sometimes to notice, but sometimes those are the places where God is in fact calling, speaking. I know that for myself, I've started paying real attention to those dreams that I keep having recurrently. You know, those ones that you have over and over and over again. Because there's some information there that I need to pay attention to. Again, this God who calls us, this God who knows us, this God who calls us by name and gives us tasks to perform in the world that he has given us. This God who knows us often speaks to us in very unexpected ways. Again, I invite you to think about those places in your own life where that's happened. The wise words of the elderly Eli this morning remind us that those voices aren't necessarily psychiatric dysfunctions, but rather they are the divine voice calling us to become what we're meant to be in the eyes of God. We're invited to respond by saying, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Well, if you're that compliant, good on you, but I wasn't. We're invited to pay attention to when God calls us by listening to those voices, but I can tell you I didn't. And those voices come in situations. They come in events. They come in people. Finally, there's that wonderful gospel lesson that we have this morning that begins the story of Jesus' work in the Gospel of John, the calling of Andrew and Peter and Philip and Nathanael. In this story, there is so much to comment on. The lessons this morning were just so rich. But I want to focus on that story emphasis where Jesus sees Nathanael. And Jesus already has seen Nathanael before Nathanael sees Jesus. And we're told that he sees Nathanael sitting under a fig tree. Now, for those of us who've grown up in the Christian tradition, we may not know what the fig tree is about. It's not a part of our Christian symbolism. But in Jewish symbolism, the fig tree was in fact the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It was the tree of God's wisdom. And to pick figs was in fact to study the wisdom of God. So here's Nathanael sitting under a fig tree, which means he's studying. He's learning, he's searching. He's already somebody that's looking for God. So here's this guy Nathanael, the sort of person who's already spiritually aware and working on his spiritual homework. And Jesus already knows him, sees him, knows what he's about. This child of Jacob, the great trickster of the Bible, who, unlike Jacob, Nathanael is pointed out as having no guile, as not being a trickster, as being straight. Just the kind of person Jesus wants as a disciple. Come and follow, he says. Come and follow me. And while Philip invites Nathanael to come and see, Jesus already knows who he is. You see, we often get mistaken into believing that evangelism is going out and trying to convince people that the church and God and Jesus and all that good stuff is what they need. Sort of like inviting them into a debate. And we sort of treat it like, well, it's sort of like a piece of clothing. You pick it up off the rack. Does it fit? Is it the right color? Do I like the style? No, I don't think so. Put it back. That's not what religion's about. That's not what faith is about. That's not what God is about. Our faith is much more powerful than that. Ours is a faith that says we are already called to be what we are in God's world before we are born. That God knows who we are. Now, we're always free to reject it. We're always free to frustrate God's call to us. We're always free to turn our backs on God over and over and over again. But I, for one, am one of those people that believes you can't do it forever. Nobody turns their back on God forever. Sometimes I'm persuaded to say that this Christian faith of ours is caught. It's not taught. You don't learn it. I was not an easy character for God to catch. I apologize for being so focused on myself here, but I know myself the best. I can tell you that what I wanted in my life and for my life was mightily resistant to what God wanted. Anyone who knows me will attest to that. It only took me 6 years to get through seminary. It was a 3-year program. I fought, I cussed, I screamed, I yelled, I did everything I could possibly do. I can tell you, though, that God kept sending me people and events in my life that forced me to turn and listen. I grew up in the days of the Civil Rights Movement. And it's Martin Luther King weekend, and it's one of those times when I had to remind myself that that was part of my calling. When I heard Dr. King speak, and I did personally hear him, it was one of the great joys of my life, only at that point in my life it terrified me. It was a tumultuous time in history. The Vietnam War was underway. I thought of myself as a conscientious objector, and then I thought of myself as going to jail, and then I thought of myself as a radical social worker, going to be a community organizer, change the world. Ha! What a joke. But those voices kept at me. They kept at me. And they kept rounding over the edges of my edgy life. I know now that I was getting what Samuel got. A call. Samuel, Samuel. Bruce, pay attention. Whack. The old 2x4. You know the 2x4 theory? It's my best theory of spirituality. If you're not paying attention, the good Lord usually takes 2x4 and whacks you right between the eyes. And if you don't get it first time, that's okay, because there'll be a second one. I got marks. Permanent marks. I had to have enough swats across my thick head that I finally had to give in. Don't get me wrong, I still get an occasional swat every once in a while, reawakening me to pay attention again to something that I've become dull of heart and mind or spirit. Happens to me a lot more than most, I think. Well, why am I meandering around all of this? If you haven't figured it out, I'm inviting you to do the same. Think about it. How's God called you? What's been God's call to you in the past? What's it looked like? What's it felt like? Have you rejected it? Are you rejecting it now? What are you supposed to be doing with your life? It's not about being in church. It's not about that. It's not about being religious or being a good person. Lots of good people out there in the world. That's not what God's calling us to be. But what is God calling you to be? Now, don't tell me if you're sitting out there with gray hair like I have now. Well, I'm beyond that now, you know. All I got to do is wait for I'm going to get dead pretty quick. Well, you've got something to do too. You do. Just because you got a few years on you doesn't mean you don't have to become a sage to the rest of the community. That you don't have wisdom to offer. That you don't have to teach the rest of us how to make it appropriately in this world. The wisdom of the elders is something I'm learning about a lot right now. So you elders out there, don't tell me you don't have anything left to do. You young people, what's God calling you to do over there? God's calling you. It's true. So, before you deny that anything like that might be happening to you, think again, because God doesn't waste God's time. But God isn't rude either. So what will it take for you to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears"? God's carrying God's work out, redeeming, restoring, making the world new, making the world a healed place. God called Martin. God called all of those people of that day to march, to stand, to sit, to walk, to stand up. God called those people to say no to war. God called those people to heal the world. God calls you. What's God calling you to do now? He's carrying his purposes out, restoring this creation, and we're called to take up our part in that cosmic drama. What's going to be your part? Amen.